Comfortable? Then I shall begin. These chairs are comfortable. Wow, thank you. Prologue, 18th of July 1823. The House Cemetery, Dundee, Scotland. Derek McCaw kept his hands in his pockets and his collar over his neck as he thought about those privileged few enjoying their evening tucked up in bed in the prosperous Perth Road, overlooking Magdalen Green. He was headed the other way, north of the High Street, towards the House Cemetery. Once it served as a combination of a meeting place and burial ground. Seen as a safe haven for all, the town trade meeting had been held there. People did their business and paid their respects for the deceased. Now it was simply a graveyard. Its high walls designed to keep the bodies in and the criminals out. Derek walked through the slightly open gate and gave a subtle nod as he passed two burly Charlies standing rigid in the cold night. The rain was relentless, and the darkening evening skies reflected his melancholy mood. He pulled his collar up further, sheltering his stubbly face from the large droplets falling from the Scottish skies. Evening, gents. You would never guess it was July, would you? Right enough, Mr. McCaw, said the larger of the two watchmen. Even the weather's given up on us. Aye, it has indeed. Well, I hope all is quiet tonight. As he spoke, Derek made his way past the ornate gateway towards Barrack Street. He pushed his hands deeper into his pockets, protecting his balled-up fists against the cold night air in his defeated mood. Don't you worry though, Mr. McCaw, shouted the smaller of the watchmen as he turned the corner. We'll look after them, all right. We'll keep our precious ones safe, won't we, Freddie? We'll make sure those bastards don't disrupt the dead. God bless their souls. Aye, Freddie said loudly, for Derek's sake. Derek heard the watchman's dialogue, and normally he would have appreciated the gesture. However, deep in his soul, he knew it was futile. Absolutely and utterly futile. He thought of Margaret, his wife. If she knew what he was about to do, he was certain it would be the end of her. If poverty or disease didn't get them, heartbreak would, he mused. He'd watched his son Jimmy as he died in Margaret's arms, observing the watery diarrhoea, the vomiting, and the pain in that small, innocent face as the boy's muscles cramped up in his legs and lower back. Watching the life pour out of his body as he was torn inside out by such a vile, putrid entity was bad enough for Derek and his wife. But the thought that those bastards would then steal his body for some posh lecture hall in Edinburgh was enough to drive Margaret mad. Derek realised that he needed to take charge. He needed to do something. He couldn't save his boy's soul, but he could save his soul. The idea had come to him as his son lay on the cold floor, his bluish skin tight and stretched from the invading disease. His mouth still open, a little vomit on his bottom lip. He knew if he didn't act, he would regret it forever. Looking at the image there would be forever, he etched it on his mind's eye. He made a pact that no one would use his little Jimmy McCaw, his 6-year-old babe, as an exhibition to those toffs whose parents had paid for the spoiled upper-class brats to dissect the bodies of the young and innocent to further their so-called education. Anatomy? Butchery, more like. As the boy's funeral earlier, a crowd had huddled behind him and Margaret. Derek remembered thinking how she had never looked so old, so frail. The small, cheap wooden coffin was placed gently onto the ground. Derek knew that the body of the son would already be decaying inside it. He was one of the many thousands of victims of the evil scourge of modern-day sickness. As Margaret had swiped another tear from her face, one more immediately replaced it. Derek once again formed fists in his pocket, but this time he had cut into his palms with his fingernails. He'd be damned if he would let his wife see him weep. He needed to be strong. As the pallbearers placed the earth onto the miniature coffin, Derek knew what he had to do before the rain packed down the soil. Once home, Margaret had cried herself to sleep. Derek had slipped on his long jacket, gently closed the door behind him and walked back to the cemetery, knowing that Alistair and Fred would already be on guard. They were the local watchmen, or Charlies, as the press had recently named them. There were over 100 names on the watchman list. Men of all ages and sizes had volunteered for the job, but they always seemed to be the same two on sentry duty night after night. Derek understood why this was. His own name was probably on that list somewhere, written in a moment of defiance to the body snatchers. When he signed it, he supposed he had every intention of doing a shift or two. But that was before cholera had gotten hold of his only son. Everyone knew the pressure these watchmen were under due to the uprising and bunking, but that didn't stop the wrath of the public and the anger towards them when the grave robbers succeeded in their plunder. Tower or no tower, lookout or no lookout, if the body snatchers got their loot, there would be targets practice for the baying mob. Derek realised it was a very unfair state of affairs. He had consulted with Alistair and Freddie shortly after the funeral in a quiet spot under an oak tree. He told them of his idea, reluctantly at first, but with more confidence when he didn't interrupt or protest to show contempt, as his fate day might. As each man held his hat in his hand and looked firmly at the ground below, Derek laid out his plan. When he had finished, the men both nodded in agreement without raising their eyes. They were both hard-working fathers after all, but they insisted that Derek would have to be the one to take action, because if they tampered with the coffin, they would find themselves being accused of bunking. Grave-robbing watchmen? Sadly, it wouldn't be the first murmur of it happening. The three men were more than aware that murmurs usually led to lynching. Derek agreed to their terms. It would be a solo act. Now it was 4 a.m, and the funeral felt like a lifetime ago. The rain had stopped, a long overdue break, but the ground was still soft as Derek dug into the moist earth with the old stained spade he had retrieved behind the small watchtower. The half-moon shone down on him as he stood spade in hand in a trench, digging down until he reached a wooden coffin that just 12 hours earlier had been lowered with the blessing of the minister. With an almighty heave, he opened the coffin lid, and a loud creak broke the silence. Derek looked inside the wooden carton, which was the part he had been dreading the most. Thankfully, the smell was no worse than he had imagined. He tried not to look at the deformed face of his lifeless young son, lying there in the Sunday best. Wiping a tear from his eye, he opened up his canvas bag and pulled out a collection of wires. He tied them around the sides of the coffin and around Jimmy's body. Squatting now, he clipped each wire into place with putty and pushed it gently against the wooden sides, using his thumb and forefinger against each other. Cautiously, Derek took another smaller bag from his larger one, unclipped it and began to prudently pour its contents around the son's head. The gunpowder lay in between his ears and the coffin walls, with some scattered over the child's face. Being careful to avoid the eyes, mouth and nostrils, Derek continued to empty the bag. As the rain began to fall again, he gently placed the empty bag back into the larger one and returned the coffin lid closed, cutting off the few loose wires underneath it. He then carefully placed the pliers and the wire cut-offs into his canvas bag. In the darkness of the night, Derek was sure the grave robbers wouldn't see his booby trap. Wiping a dirty hand over his face and removing his cap, he quickly said a silent prayer and began the job of placing the earth back onto the coffin. As he walked, he occasionally looked over his shoulder in case some of the newly appointed Dundee police force saw the movement, or, even worse, members of the general public. They would almost certainly take him for a grave robber. Things were so bad that people often decided to take the law into their own hands, and the last thing poor suffering Margaret needed was a lynch mob tearing her husband from limb to limb. After 20 dark and cold minutes, Derek flattened the earth and placed a spade behind the nearest gravestone. He looked again at his son's gravestone. Sacred to the memory of James McCaw, aged only 6 years. He died of cholera, 13th of July, 1823. The monument is erected by a few of his numerous friends and as a mark of their affectionate regard and esteem, and of the deep regret they felt as his untimely death. Derek placed his cap firmly on his head and walked back the way he came, clutching the bag over the shoulder. He whistled as he did so, giving Alistair and Freddie the signal to keep a steady watch now that his vigilant act was complete. Derek walked home through the cobbled streets of Meadowside. He quietly let himself into the house, took off his dirty boots, placed his jacket and hat onto a chair, shoved his back under the table so that evidence could be removed the following day, and let out a large sigh. Then he got into bed next to his sobbing wife and gently held her hand below the bedsheet. When sleep finally found him, Derek dreamt of open graves, of resurrectionists, of skeletons, of decaying flesh. He dreamt of baying mobs and diarrhea, of disease and the destruction of flesh. His nightmares had become as dark as the world outside. Before morning came, he was awakened by the noise of a loud blast. "What was that, Derek?" asked Margaret, wiping her eyes. "It sounded like an explosion. Was it the factory?" "Nothing, dear. Go back to sleep," Derek replied, as a tear rolled down his dirty cheek and onto the pillow below. There lies the first. Thank you.